When they recalled me and my colleagues, it was $1 million recall campaign on a school board race. Primarily, the folks who were being targeted were Black women in leadership roles within education. I was recalled, but really what they did was they abandoned Black students who were asking for help. You look at the right-wing high school media, you've got campus reform. It's like the college version of InfoWars. They basically pay students to write articles that then go into the right-wing pipeline. The Unite the Right rally was the beginning of practicing for January 6th. You have these moms who show up at the school board and they're working for a nonprofit that's all been supported by these right-wing PACs, and then they go to the school board and they scream, and there's somebody who's videoing them, and they hand it off to Fox News, which does a news cycle. And then you've got a whole bunch of bots and trolls on Twitter, and they start sharing that news cycle. And it gets so loud that then mainstream media is like, well, I guess we got to cover it.
Welcome, friends, family, and fighters of all ages. This is round 6 of Season Fighters, a show where we step into the ring with champions of social change so we can learn the art of fighting back. And in the blue corner, we have an educator, writer, and activist known for her fearless advocacy on behalf of low-income Black, Brown, immigrant, and LGBTQ families. She's currently working on several projects to elevate the voices of marginalized communities, including the Just Talks podcast, a show focused on sharing knowledge from artists, activists, educators, and other thought leaders to protect and preserve public education and our democracy. And she's also a former guest on LLAG Radio, making her debut on Season Fighters. Please welcome our next fighter, Allie Collins. Allie, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. I appreciate the opportunity.
Glad to have you back, Allie. So I'm super happy to have you back on the show. It's been years since we last discussed, and a lot has happened in the world of education, in disinformation. And you are somebody with deep experience, not only observing and understanding right-wing propaganda, but you've also been the target of one of the most extreme right-wing harassment campaigns that I've ever seen. But before we get into some of those details, I want to set the stage for our audience because you lived and worked in San Francisco for years. I mean, San Francisco and California have always been depicted as these progressive utopias, that are from the outside looking in, people think everyone's a communist, everyone is super, super far left. But anyone actually in the know recognizes there is a friction in the city between, the artist and immigrant foundation of San Francisco and then the rise of this big tech, big money side. So as somebody who's lived in San Francisco, what were some of the early signs when you started to notice this shift towards this more right-wing tech, big money?
I think that people started to notice it after there was that the first big bust of the dot-com boom. And I don't know if you remember this because this is kind of going back, but when we had pets.com and there were all these tech companies that had been getting more and more money for basically ideas, and a lot of them didn't have products, and there was this big bust that happened, and it was around 2008. There was two of them. There was one in the 2000s, and then there was another one in 2008. We had the recession, and between those periods of time, we started to see more and more of Silicon Valley types visiting San Francisco, coming to San Francisco. And then we started seeing more and more of these. They were like Google buses, and there was more controversy. And there were people talking about the fact that these private buses were taking up public bus lanes. And, this conversation of tech wealth and whether it, how did it integrate into the city? And I was somebody who moved to San Francisco. It would be 30 years ago, right? So it was 1996 is when I moved. But you would hear people talking about how, they were born and raised, and that this conversation of being a native born San Franciscan and non-native became a real topic because people who were born and raised there started to really feel the push and started to feel the displacement. And there were several reports that came out around that time. Black people, when I first moved to the city, made up about 12% of the city, and in the school district, they made up 25%. And it started getting lower and lower to 6%. You started seeing this widespread displacement, and development started happening in traditionally Black and brown neighborhoods. And so obviously there were concerns as more and more tech folks decided to move. It was crazy to me because when I first had my girls in 2005, parents were still saying, oh, you can't raise kids in San Francisco. Like it was so urban and inner city, which I thought was just a joke, considering the fact that I had grown up in LA, gone to school in New York in the 90s, when it, lived in Alphabet City in the Bowery, where it really was dangerous. And living in San Francisco, it was just it's always been a beautiful city. And so to hear people saying, oh, you can't raise kids there, and then seeing more and more tech folks moving there and starting families, and then starting to kind of push their political will on the city, you really started to feel it in the sense that you had people who came to San Francisco because they liked the culture, they liked the art scene, they liked the kind of funky, grungy vibe, and then immediately started wanting to change that. And that's something that really bothered me. I respect folks who I wanted to kind of assimilate as a San Franciscan. I wanted to contribute to the community, and seeing outsiders come in and then want to change parts of the mission that have a history for the Latino community, or buy up buildings in Chinatown. Like, it was very concerning. And after the 2008 recession, we had two supervisors, Supervisor Jane Kim at the time, and Supervisor David Chu, representing progressive and moderate politicians, made a deal with Twitter to give them a tax deal, and it was called the Twitter tax. And that was really the beginning of the end, because there was an underutilized building in a part of San Francisco. It immediately was filled up by Twitter, and that's kind of when most people would say the shift started. And it just continued to escalate until when we really saw the impact of that kind of infiltration, I would say, by these, a group of folks who had a lot more wealth, and maybe had sensibilities that weren't, invested in being members of San Francisco and being in community with San Francisco residents, was when COVID hit. And, a lot of workers stopped going to work. We closed schools. But immediately, because everyone went online, there was this huge boom. Even though everybody was suffering, there was one economy that really did well during COVID, and that was online, right? Everyone got on Zoom. Everyone needed that connection that we got through social media. If you weren't on TikTok, or if you weren't on Facebook, or if you weren't on Twitter, you got online. And I think, unfortunately, the folks, these tech oligarchs that, they invested in infrastructure to make more money. And they also saw opportunities to surveil us, sell our data, and start investing, honestly, in local political campaigns. And that was this huge shift. And there's even articles written about it. But they started realizing, like, we have wealth. And so if we don't like the way things are, and you even hear Peter Thiel, talking about this, we don't want to have to convince people that our ideas are good. because people don't like their ideas, we can just buy media, and we can control algorithms to control, whose voices get heard, and um, we can even buy community organizations, which is what started happening in San Francisco, and they started manufacturing uh, the illusion of a movement. And unfortunately, I don't think, progressives and were really prepared for the amount of wealth and what that would mean politically in our city. And just to give a quick example, I ran as a first time school board candidate. I had no political experience. I was an organizer, but San Francisco is not a huge city. When you think of LA, when you think of New York, Chicago, it is really small. I ran on a grassroots campaign I raised $40,000, which is like a joke. I was told that I had to earn at least $100,000 to be considered a viable candidate. But because I had a blog and because I had been working in the community and had name recognition, I won. Out of 19 candidates, I got the most votes on $40,000. And I think there were other candidates who had raised more money, but that's the scale of how campaigns were then. When they recalled me and my colleagues, it was $1 million recall campaign on a school board race. And so you've just seen this escalation. And I do believe this is happening across the country in key races where national politicians, national Republicans see opportunities to shape public opinion. They've targeted local races, whether they're small, county races, or school board races, and they've just overwhelmed them with money, and they've been able to capture political power. And then, that was in around 2020, they were able to, over time, just progressively expand their reach.
And so now that we have sort of this understanding of the foundation, interesting enough, I actually remember the Google buses in Santa Clara showing up,
Yeah.
and how a lot of people felt slighted because the existing infrastructure wasn't as good and reliable, and they're like, "What? Why is this a priority for them?" But so now we have San Francisco's
Mm-hmm.
Right-wing big money ecosystem developing. And you're noticing these changes in the city, you're noticing these changes around the country. And I mean, that is really when that era of anti-woke, anti-DEI propaganda really started to blow up. Um, and especially meeting you, it placed that on my radar. And I started to just recognize it all over the place. But one of the things that you had discovered was that a lot of these campaigns that were framed as grassroots campaigns were not grassroots. They were funded by right wing PACs, like you said, $1 million to try to
Yeah.
recall you. All these powerful people with deep pockets. Uh, can you talk to us and what can you tell us about astroturfing and this rise of the ecosystem being targeted at educators, at school boards, at the education system? Like for people who are just looking at headlines and they don't know the forest from the trees, can you give us a sort of breakdown of what's going on?
Well, I'll try and keep it simple, but I think I sounded crazy when I talked about this when it was happening, and now it's happened so much. I think it's very easy to see what's happened. But Trump was elected, he lost the election. And I remember hearing pundits talk about the fact that they were going to target white suburban women as voters. And Chris Rufo, who's known for the anti-CRT, anti-DEI, it's a political narrative campaign. He approached Trump and he told him, that's what we have to do. We've got to engage these white women. And they targeted the 1619 Project. And I don't know if you remember, that was Nicole Hannah-Jones. And they actually, I think Trump put out an executive order saying like it was banned in some way or shape or form. As soon as Biden took over, he immediately said this is ridiculous. But state by state, ALEC, which is this big right-wing kind of organization that they basically boilerplate legislation for right-wing representatives, and then they don't have to write the policies, they just push them through. You started seeing state by state a lot of these anti-Black history curriculums, policies going forward at the state level. And specifically, they were banning the 1619 Project, and they were also banning things like you might have heard in Florida, they were banning AP, African American history classes, right? And LGBTQ books. And this kind of slid under the radar of a lot of Democrats, which was really unfortunate. And at the time, we had, this is post George Floyd, a lot of school districts had been making a lot of strides in actually enacting policies to support Black, Latino, and LGBTQ students. And there was a backlash. And because what they figured out is if they led the backlash with parents, with moms, then they could basically take political power, because you're not going to argue with a white mom. And in another way, women are not seen as really a threat, even though, the Karen videos are all over. We know how aggressive, we know how destructive that kind of anger can be. But basically, they figured out that during COVID, if they weaponized white women's rage in school board meetings, school boards are a place where nobody really pays attention except for parents, right? If you don't have kids, you're not going to pay attention to, you don't even pay attention to local, city ordinances, let alone what's happening in the school board. So they were able to go into school districts and scream their heads off about masking, mask mandates or vaccines, which then led to trans policies. And, I think what was unique was that you as a school board member, you always have people that show up during public comment, and there's going to be, you want to have freedom of speech. There's always going to be somebody saying some crackpot thing, and that's, you give them their time and then you move along with the work. But what was notable was we started noticing that, those same people would show up, and then there would be an article in the New York Times. And that's when it started getting really fishy. I started noticing that every time we would have a big vote on something that was contentious locally with our local right wingers, it would be a New York Times or Washington Post article that would come out on a Thursday before. It'd have the whole weekend cycle to kind of gain steam. And then on Monday, it was just this crazy thing. And in the past, I had always been able to call local news organizations and media and tell them, these are the perspectives I'm listening to, and my colleagues were as well. But it was almost like, as an elected leader, we couldn't get a word in edgewise to even clarify where there was misinformation. So, we would have some informed political debate. And so I started sharing my concerns with other folks. And, I was on Twitter at the time. Folks started reaching out to me from Virginia and started saying, it sounds a lot like what's going on with you is happening here in Fairfax and Loudoun County, Virginia, which they were engaged in electing Glenn Youngkin, who at the time was pushing this anti-CRT tip hotline about you should, call in teachers who are teaching CRT, and they're indoctrinating your kids. And as we started sharing stories, we realized we were being targeted by the exact same people. And that's when it got really wild. So that's when, and so additionally, I have friends online who do research, And they started researching like who's behind these attacks and who's writing these articles and who's funding these parent groups. And that's when we started really seeing just wild connections. Like one of the women who was leading this anti-mask group in San Francisco, she would just brag about how awesome Florida was and the fact that you could walk around without masks during COVID, before we had vaccines, before we had, you know, like it was crazy. And then and she was the vice president of Levi's Strauss marketing department. So this is
Wow.
not a small woman, right? This is a woman who understands messaging. She's the head of she was a VP of marketing at Levi's. She was saying so much crazy anti-mask stuff that even Levi's was like, you need to shut up because people in our company are getting upset with what you're saying. And she ended up, having to resign. And then it turns out she's doing a tour with DeSantis and she's a Moms for DeSantis. And then and then I started doing my podcast and I talked to Dr. Isaac Kamala, and he's done a lot of research on these dark money campaigns. And he basically laid out the whole strategy for me. And I was like, it all makes sense now. And he explained, oh yeah, you have these, moms who show up at the school board and they're working for a nonprofit that's all been supported by these right-wing PACs. And then they go to the school board and they scream and there's somebody who's videoing them and they hand it off to Fox News, which does a news cycle. And then you've got a whole bunch of bots and trolls on Twitter and they start sharing that news cycle. And it gets so loud that then mainstream media says like, well, I guess we got to cover it because it's something people are talking about. And nobody's really doing the research on who's actually pushing these stories. Who are these moms? And if you really look at them, it's crazy. Like one of the women who was targeting me was a Virginia mom, and she was also a former journalist for the Washington Post, and so she's not just a mom, she was also a woman who was saying she was a Democrat that voted for Trump, right? So it's like, and you look at these people across the board, there was a woman in Texas as well who came up with the South Lake strategy. And I don't know if you've heard that. That's a really great podcast. You have to listen to it. It's at the beginning, and it's in South Lake, Texas, where students basically, they were called the N-word. There was this horrible racist incident, and parents and teachers got together to make sure that their schools were safe. And the community, when they came to implement those policies, they wrote in and said, this is indoctrination and this is crazy. And the mom leading that charge made herself a political career out of it. And you see this pattern. Then once you see it, it's kind of like, I don't know, if you have a dog, you start, you have an Australian Shepherd, you start noticing everybody with an Australian Shepherd, right? When you see this pattern, you start to notice that these moms, all of them end up running for office, right? They all end up running for office. And I've even gotten to the point now where I've reached out to folks who've been targeted to tell them, look, I think you're, being targeted by a right-wing smear campaign. This is not organic. This is kind of, what they're doing, and talk to them. And then they'll say, I'll ask them, who's targeting you? And they'll tell me. And then it always turns out they're involved with real estate. They're involved with charter schools. They're connected to right-wing lawyers, and all of them invariably run for office. Like in Southern Cal, there's a group that's been targeting folks in Chino Valley, California. And surprise, surprise, the woman ran for school board. She got on the school board, and now she's running for state superintendent of education. So it's a pattern. And unfortunately, the media will not talk about it. And, no matter, me and my friends have consistently, in the beginning, we were reaching out to local news agencies and saying, you need to do the reporting, not just on the outrage, but on who's behind the outrage campaign. And no one will cover it. So.
Wow. Earlier when you said CRT, I kind of had a whiplash because I forgot that CRT was the movement before DEI and the anti-woke movement. And it's wild because that was years ago, and it was already such a sophisticated system that just kind of plopped out of the air and it was fully fleshed out. But that was also before Trump. And then now that Trump is in office, I can only imagine how much things have changed. And I mean, not just relative to the whole anti-woke, anti-DEI side of that movement, but even just the overall attacks on education and educators. Um, so since then, how have things evolved? How intricate has it become? Are they still targeting educators? Is it more specific? Like, what's their game plan now? How has it shifted?
Well, it's unfortunate because what's happened is what we said would happen, but people didn't listen. um, Primarily, the folks who were being targeted were Black women in leadership roles within education. So there was principals, school board leaders, superintendents, um, and white folks who were leading anti-racist, work in schools, and LGBTQ leaders. And because it's, who cares about, school boards, right? It's just a lot of information people don't pay attention to. And so in a way they were testing out, what can we get away with, right? What can we get away with in terms of running these smear campaigns, getting people elected, taking local power? People don't understand that the school board is a stepping stone to city office, right? You run for, in San Francisco, you run for school board, then you run for like supervisor, then you run for mayor, then you can run, and you've seen that, this ladder. So people understand that within the right wing. And when we were targeted on the school board, one of the main things that I was targeted for, what's crazy is two of the things I was targeted for, I didn't even initiate, but it doesn't matter. I was targeted for voting to remove a racist mural in a high school. I didn't write that resolution. I support the work because students said that they were traumatized by these horrific and, racist images. But we were blamed for doing something that was actually initiated by white men, and then additionally, we were blamed for not opening schools soon enough. We didn't open schools because we didn't have resources to open them safely. We were actively trying to open them and being denied resources by the mayor who wanted to make it a political game. But the one thing we did do, and I'm proud of, is we integrated a school and we initiated a equity audit after Black students were called pornographic. They were attacked with pornographic hate speech. And integrating this school was such a hot button in San Francisco that it basically galvanized neo-segregationists in San Francisco and across the country, because a lot of other districts like Boston, Fairfax, Loudoun County, Virginia, because kids were in staying at home and they were learning online, it wasn't fair to have some of these exam-based enrollments, of these elite high schools that basically result in school segregation. And so they all kind of united across the country. And the group that targeted me is basically like a Moms for Liberty San Francisco. They're called Friends of Lowell Foundation. And the reason I call them Moms for Liberty of San Francisco is the lawyer who actually did the paperwork for Moms for Liberty to make them a 501c3 or 501c4 or whatever they are is a man named Chris Marsden, who's a GOP lawyer in Virginia. And he's the same lawyer who did the paperwork for Moms for Liberty, did the paperwork for Friends of Lowell Foundation. And he did it for a whole bunch of other groups across the country. So that's the other thing is, okay, we'll change the name because that won't fly in SF, but it's like a factory. And so they teamed up with folks in Loudoun County who also have an elite high school that they were seeking to make more racially diverse. And they teamed up with a man named Ed Bloom, who everyone should know, but a lot of people don't. He is connected with the Federalist Society. He's responsible for packing the Supreme Court. And he has consistently been interested in dismantling voting rights. He's the man who initially did the anti-affirmative action case. And he did the where it was the white woman sued for saying she was being racially discriminated against, and everyone laughed her out of court. He brought it back with the Friends of Lowell and these people in Loudoun County, Virginia, and they dismantled affirmative action. And so that was the ultimate goal, was dismantling affirmative action leads to dismantling of any rights that you have, that based on discrimination and representation in schools, they can be applied to work, they can be applied to housing. And so that was the first, when that happened, I knew, and I was telling people, people don't care, unfortunately, about education. And a lot of even liberals, they like the idea of merit, and they like the idea that their kids are smarter than other people's kids, and they want unfair, privileges. And so they didn't fight for it. And unfortunately, once that passed, Ed Bloom and his team, there's a lot of these other PACs, they started targeting school districts that were basically funding programs to support Black students. And so immediately Harmeet Dillon, who is currently now she is working as the head of the Department of the Civil Rights Division of the Department of Justice. She's right at the time she was a GOP lawyer. But she immediately started targeting. They were suing Los Angeles Unified for a Black Student Success Program. They started suing Chicago, and school districts had to basically decide whether, if they couldn't afford the lawsuits, even if they knew that their programs were not racially biased, and were for the benefit of students, they started restructuring things. And so you saw this huge wave of lawsuits. So this is the other pieces. You pass policies and then you use those policies. They're funded by lawyers. There's these big coffers of money where they can just, find people to use as plaintiffs in lawsuits. And they just, it's lawfare. They just annihilate people with lawsuits. And so that started happening. And ultimately, as soon as Trump took office, he installed Harmeet Dillon in the Department of Justice, Civil Rights Division. She's currently using civil rights legislation to dismantle civil rights. So I'm going to say that again. She's currently using civil rights legislation to dismantle civil rights. And I just read an article that she is basically pressuring, they've fired a huge amount of people who are working in the federal government, right? All the federal workers that DOJ went in and just fired based on an algorithm. The ones that are still there, she is pressuring them to basically push forward meritless cases of discrimination against white men. And that's basically what's happening, right? And additionally, now you have, I'm hearing now it's over 600,000 Black women there's at least 300,000 Black women since last year, but the numbers keep rising of Black women who've been pushed out of the workforce. And not when it started happening, nobody cared. But what people don't understand is, and similarly with trans issues, in these bathroom laws, they find a group and see what they can get away with. And if it's tolerated, then they expand. And that's always the way it is. And so now, they're not concerned about education because they're moving on to phase 2, which is now we'll see the same things that have been happening in education will now be applied to housing rights. They will be applied to, work, like the access to work, or, discrimination, work discrimination. And so, that's what's next. I mean, we're already seeing a lot of people being displaced, but the protections that the federal government has always been there since the civil rights era. A lot of these organizations, like the Department of Education, the Department of Justice, a lot of these federal offices were set up as a backstop, right, to protect people when locally things were unjust or unfair. There was always the ability to, you could take something to the Supreme Court, or you could file a complaint with the Office of Civil Rights Division, or, that's gone now. So people are basically now left with their state government. And, in some states, people don't have any rights in certain areas. In California, in Illinois, maybe you have those rights, but those rights are currently then being targeted and undermined by the federal government, right? And it's scary. If you take something to the Supreme Court, you could end up undermining. I mean, it's crazy. Laws that have been put in place are now being undermined by the judicial branch, like actual laws. And so that's what we've seen now with the civil rights, that the Voting Act, right? You had actual legislation is being dismantled by the court system. And so it puts, I think, progressives in a tricky situation. We used to file lawsuits because then we could get justice. Now the question is, do you actually want it to go to the Supreme Court? People have to game out what happens if you lose. There are implications nationally when that happens. So didn't want to cheer you up.
I mean, taking a worse situation and just exponentially making it worse.
Sorry.
I mean, I'm glad that you're laying this out, though, because we've both been sounding the alarm on misinformation, propaganda, and I definitely want to stay on the topic, because this has only been growing and becoming more sophisticated and integrated. And I want to actually hone in specifically what you were mentioning about this appeal towards these white women and making them become these political darlings. And so I don't know if you had seen, but Elon Musk's former girlfriend, baby mama, Ashley St. Clair, she used to be former MAGA influencer, and she was like recruited when she was really young. And she, ever since breaking up with Elon, she has been talking about her experiences. And one of the things that she's been talking about is how many MAGA influencers are just paid. They're just 100% paid. There is a private group chat where people can send them money, and because they're just influencers, they don't have to disclose it because it's just, it's a minor expense. And one area in particular that you had mentioned that I haven't heard of is comms moms. So what are comms moms, and what should we know about them?
I don't know where I got this. I'm sure somebody else came up with it, but this idea of comms moms, they're communications moms. And it's, so for example, the woman who targeted me, I found out she's in Virginia, and she was writing stories about me. Her name, well, I don't want to elevate her, but she was a former Washington Post journalist, and she was, she was on Fox News like multiple times as this mom from Virginia who had a nonprofit. And yet when you look at the nonprofit, you find out it's funded. On the board is Ed Bloom. You mean Ed Bloom, the guy from the Federalist Society? And then she's also there, you start to find out that there's all these organizations that these same people are a part of. And so instead of just being this independent, like, same thing with the Moms for Liberty, you look at them and they're all politically connected. They're like, gee, I don't know how we did it. I guess we're just really popular. We raised $1 million in 2 months. That's not normal, right? And I know, because I'm a real mom who's organized, and you're like basically spending your own money to go to Costco and get people pizza, so they'll show up to your like little rally. So the fact that these women all of a sudden have like PR people, they're in the, I mean, a real big tell is if somebody's in like on, Good Morning America and you've never heard of them, right? And it's like, what? I never heard of this woman. And this was happening to us. She's on Good Morning America talking about pods, during the pandemic. I'm like, that is not normal. And you Google them and you've got like 3 stories already. Like, as you know, as somebody who's experienced in communications, it is hard to get your work showcased. It is hard to make, you have to know how to make a pitch. You have to be succinct. You have to know who the editor is. You have to know the style of the, organization that you're pitching to. You're competing with a whole bunch of other people trying to get their work there. And so when you see, like, I'm just a mom, I have no experience in education, but I'm in an op-ed in the New York Times, right? Like, that's not normal. And then if you, I mean, just for fun, I would start looking up these people and I would just Google them. And you can even go to LinkedIn and you find out they all work, there's like moms talking about why, public schools are bad. They all happen to like be associated with charter schools and so that's, what people need to look at who's doing the speaking. And it's just so easy now. I think people read the headlines and they don't even read the article, let alone looking at the names and looking at, who's speaking, right? Like I was started following stuff that was going on in Riverside and San Diego area. There was all these, crazy things happening down there. And, you get these people, they're like, I'm just a neighbor. And none of them send their kids to public school. Like I said, they all end up running for office. They all have connections to like Ed Bloom or Moms for Liberty or, a lot of these right-wing groups. And yet, for some reason, these reporters who are supposed to be really good at investigating things never seem to ask, like, who's funding the organizations or who's, where these people have, expertise. And a lot of them, they're former political strategists, like literally political strategists or communications professionals or journalists. And there is a lot of money. And that's one thing that Isaac Kamala told me about. If you look at the right wing high school media, you've got campus reform. I don't know if you've heard of it. It's like the college version of InfoWars. They basically pay students to write articles that then go into the right-wing pipeline. So if you're a journalist student and you want to make money, write right-wing articles because you can get paid and you will get published and then you're automatically in that pipeline. And so a lot of even the journalists, there's a pipeline, for your career is set. That's why, this influencer thing is just an extension of that into social media.
Wow, must be nice. Must be nice to just get, an easy $1 million.
I know, wouldn't it be nice? And you got somebody to edit your videos and all that.
Wow. I mean, so now that we have an understanding of the landscape, sort of the origins, how it is right now, I want to actually look into the rearview mirror and specifically talk about the progressive side of the movement, especially in the 2010s, because I mean, looking back, it's such a different time. Like, it really is. And I mean, just the lessons that we have learned and that we failed to learn from the Black Lives Matter movement. Because on one hand, it was great to see this increase in awareness of systemic racism and see this public dialogue that race matters and that we need to talk about it. And especially just this growth of progressive spaces. But on the other hand, a lot of Black folks who are in those spaces and who, have participated in them have talked about how it wasn't all that great and that there was a lot of mistreatment in those same progressive communities. And so, as somebody who has worked in all different levels of community organizing and activism politics, how does anti-Blackness manifest in these progressive spaces, and why is it ultimately a sign of doom or failure?
I don't know. It's really hard for me to. I think what a lot of us have realized. I was brought up. I'm a member of the loving generation, right? My parents were married at a time when, if they were in a different state, they would not. It would have been illegal to be married. In California, it was legal, but it still wasn't. It was a new thing, and we believed at that time we were changing the world, and everyone was going to be mixed and happy, and racism would go away. And I think that even though I knew that, racism exists and sexism exists and all that, I think we had this optimism, um, moving up through there was the Black Lives Matter movement, 2016, there was a lot of protests and awareness started to change. People started talking about race in San Francisco. More and more people started, there was a Black parent group that I was a member of starting to give Black parents representation in the district. Things like that were happening at a local level across the country. People started talking about renaming schools, renaming streets that were named after Confederate soldiers, those kinds of things. And then after George Floyd, it really, people said, we need to change. And that's when you saw, but there was a huge backlash. And I'm thinking about like the Unite the Right rally was the beginning. And I think not enough people talk about that, but that was the beginning of kind of practicing for January 6th. And this is what I talked about with Dr. Walter Grayson on my podcast. And it was crazy when he said it, but it's true. He said January 6th was practice because all the people who went there, they came back to their local towns and then they started storming school boards. And you saw this rise of political activity and really threatening behavior on a local level. And they started kind of taking off the masks. And that's when, but what's unfortunate is that's also when I think Black folks that were in progressive spaces started to really see what white allies, what they were willing to do and what they weren't willing to do. And what I witnessed was that there were a lot of folks who were fine, like putting a Black square on their Facebook page when it was cool, or joining a book club. But when it came to actually dealing with white terrorism, which is what it is, it's white terrorism, right? Or, people terrorizing trans people, like they just didn't want to deal with that. And so, and in San Francisco, unfortunately, we saw a lot of folks abandon Black students. I mean, I was recalled, but really what they did was they abandoned Black students who were asking for help and saying that they were experiencing racist hate speech in their school. I was removed from office in a political smear campaign. And 1 year, like the woman who replaced me called children riffraff on the school board. She said her kid didn't like being with riffraff. And then she also didn't get elected when she ran the second time, because she said that Black kids don't and parents don't care about education, right? Like these are the people that, it's just like, and these people still, for whatever reason, have social currency. And additionally, a lot of the progressives that were supposed to be standing up for Black and immigrant communities, it's always like the double standard. I think that's what Black people really started to notice. Like I was canceled because because I talked about racism in the Asian community 4 years before I was elected. But there are supervisors in my city who were caught drinking. There was, being alcoholics. There have been supervisors, the people who've been, they've said that they've sexually harassed folks. Like there's a whole number of, stuff that you hear people do. And yet, for whatever reason, women in leadership positions, Black women specifically, you just get canceled and nobody's there, to back you up, whereas people are always there to back up they're always there to back up white liberals and, and stuff like that. So I think, even recently on TikTok, I got on TikTok and there's, with Kamala Harris, you saw a lot of activity. And I think some of these people are paid political operatives, but they're supposed leftists that were basically saying they couldn't vote for Kamala Harris and targeting her and targeting Black women who were supportive of her. And a lot of them were white women, and also saying that they couldn't support her because of Palestine. And I think what a lot of, or calling Black people who supported Kamala anti-Palestine. And what's so crazy is for Black people to say, like, if anything, we understand what it's like to be oppressed. You don't hear Black people trashing Palestinians. And yet, she was being held to a much higher standard. And you even see this with Jasmine Crockett, with the recent race there were a lot of people saying, you can't vote for her because she hasn't said enough about Palestine. And yet her challenger, like, he's getting funded by people who are associated with right wingers. He's voted on things that maybe could be considered, supportive of Israel. Like, it's never the same, like, rules that apply to us, and we're never protected. And I think that's when Black people, after this last race, for this presidential campaign, and definitely after Stacey Abrams, Black people have realized, like, there is nobody that we can count on outside of our community. And the 92% is solid. Like, that's kind of crazy, right? 92% of Black women voted for Kamala Harris. Like, and not all of us are the same, like, for that amount of people to vote one way and it's not because she's she's Black or whatever. It's because we understand we're the most politically educated demographic of any voter demographic in the country. And we understand what it means to vote to protect our community and other communities. And anyway, it's interesting to me to see the shift. And I'm sad about where we are in this country right now as because of the choices that have been made. But I think Black people, we realize, like, we've been used as like attack dogs. We're the ones who are supposed to be defending everybody when we're like swords and shields for every movement. And that's in a way, that's the racism that the left has, we've been targets of the right, but on the left, we've been used as mules, kind of, and we don't get credit. You think about Stacey Abrams, all the work she's done for the Democratic Party, and yet we're never elevated to real positions of leadership, right? You look at Congress, people who are making decisions, they're always, they're never progressive Black people or even Black, so that's the kind of thing that I think Black people are witnessing. And so we're like, okay, it's not up to us to change it. I think a lot of Black folks are focused on just protecting their communities and, weathering this storm that we're going through. And I think for me, this is the light at the end of the tunnel, or this is the silver lining, is that I think it's shown people of all backgrounds that really the most important thing that we have is community and supporting one another. And so where I find hope is that Black women are really supporting one another. We check in on each other. I mean, I just reach out every once in a while, think of a friend and say, I better check in on her, see how she's doing, and not take that for granted. That the strongest among us sometimes we also need support. And also the communities that people are building to support immigrant communities, the rapid response networks and things like that. Neighbors are getting to know one another, and people are starting to see, who can I count on when times are tough, when things are really scary, who can I truly count on to be there and have my back? And that is a gift, even if your community seems smaller, when you know that, you've got the ride or die friends and family, your real true family and your family that you create. I think that has been the positive, I think, that's come out of this time.
So, before the discussion, I had prepared myself. I did a lot of reading of some of the horrible things that people have published about you, a lot of them from a lot of these right wing groups. And I just started to remember all of the horrible crap that people did to you and the traumatic shit that you and your family went through. And you had described this experience as a targeted online lynching campaign, which I fully agree with, because this wasn't just silly jokes and memes. Uh, a lot of these were dangerous people who are threatening your life, your home, your kid's life, your husband. And so the threat of physical violence is one thing, but then there's also the psychological trauma that comes packaged with that. And thankfully, we sort of left a lot of that mess in the past. But I know that you're still going through this process of healing. You're in this new chapter in your life. How did you break out of that? What has that healing process been like? What is working for you now, and what would you advise for anybody else who's sort of a victim of a similar campaign?
Well, number one, I think when I was going through this, I didn't know other people were going through it. And initially I thought, it's hard to understand when you get targeted. You don't really know what's going on. And if you're a thoughtful, empathetic person, you wonder, did I do something? It takes a while to realize, oh, this is, a political smear campaign. And if anything, this sounds, bad, but as it progressed, this started in 2020, 2021 is when it was really at its peak. It continued, it still continues, but more and more people, I started seeing more and more people getting targeted. And this sounds awful, but if you go to the Turning Point USA I was on the hit list on Turning Point USA. I'm not anymore, but me and my colleagues were on there as a school board watch list, right? But there's also a woke educator watch list, a professor watch list. And I know they're my, colleagues, they're getting targeted too. And I've even reached out a few times to folks and said, hey, do you know you're on the watch list? And there was one professor who said, no, I didn't. But that explains why I'm getting all this hate mail. And so there's a lot of us out there, and every year there's more. In fact, now I have one of my closest friends, she tweeted about the fact that all of her stuff was stolen. She had a U-Haul that was stolen, and she complained about the fact that San Francisco put in a whole bunch of these flock cameras so they can monitor everything, and they couldn't find her U-Haul. And it's what's the point of having this to surveil all of us if you can't find my stuff? So she tweeted that, and all of a sudden she was in the New York Post. She said her mom called her because she saw her on Fox News. Her friend from India said, Darcy, why are you on TV? And so they just decided to to target her because she had been critical of police in San Francisco. So we're at this point now where anyone could be targeted for anything they say. My friend Ernest Krim III, who's a really great content creator, educator, he believes his account was targeted. He was basically removed from Instagram, and he had 500,000 followers, right? And so anyone at any time could decide they don't like you, and they can target you, and they can say ridiculous lies about you, and get your accounts flagged, cause problems for you at work. I'm not alone. And so I think part of what got me out of it was building community and reaching out to other folks. I would see other folks and say, oh my God, I know that this is the same thing that happened to me. This is a targeting campaign. And I would reach out to them, and I've made friends across the country. I've made friends there's former superintendent and principals and parents, regular parents who are PTA moms who had smear campaigns against them and had their PTA, destroyed in their public. I mean, these attacks, they're trying to hurt people, not just threatening them physically, but they're trying to harm people financially, help, keep people from getting jobs and harm their mental health. And so the best thing is community, right? We heal in community. My parents were both psychologists, but I feel, and so there's things you do to take care of yourself. And writing for me has been writing is healing. And it's been a huge way for me to basically acknowledge my feelings, recognize them. And, it's a way to kind of name what's going on and give you a sense of personal validation, but also just forming a community of others, and for me also reaching out to support others. If I'm going to go through something crappy, then I might as well use it to help somebody else, right? And so that's why I started the podcast, because I wanted folks to understand what was happening, because I knew there were other folks, and I'm still connected. I still get, every once in a while I get connected to another person. There's a educator in Pennsylvania he's been fired without cause from his job because he teaches ethnic studies, right? And so it's still going on, but I believe it's like the witch trials. They kept targeting new women, and then eventually they targeted somebody who was like the daughter of somebody famous or wealthy, and then it stopped, right? There's going to be a point when they just go too far. And along the way, I think more and more people are able to see what's happening because they're actually getting targeted by these really, malicious, it's just, all this fake news. So I think being in community and gardening, spending time with my dog, and spending less time online, building spaces like this, the space that you're creating. I'm working on projects to build spaces on my Patreon, websites. People are doing zines, doing meetups, actually building community. That's how we heal, is in community with one another. So, and I think, like I said, even though this is a really tough time, I think what we're doing right now, what many people are doing, is building that muscle, building an infrastructure that has to do with us as a social network. Social networks, this is my new thing. Social networks existed before the apps. We were connected, and we were connecting with one another, and we need to do more of that. And we need to support one another, do mutual aid, rapid response groups, things like that. Go out, walk around, meet our neighbors, volunteer at our schools. That's how we heal and build community. And no matter what happens, the networks that we build are going to sustain us. And we're building a movement. We don't know where that's going to go, but I have no question that these connections that we're building, we're going to utilize. You look at Minnesota, they're able to do what they're doing because of the Black Lives Matter movement, because of the protests that people were organized before ICE came in, and they had that infrastructure, that social infrastructure that they've been relying on to then, protect their neighbors. And I think more and more of us are doing that now. And I that's where I see the hope. And that's where we will save us, right? We're in charge of saving us.
I'm, even just hearing how you've processed that whole thing, I think it's great because it really is a testament to who you are and your character. Because being targeted by thousands of random assholes, like, a lot of people would just either retreat and never want to show their face, or maybe they might be like, you know what, give me a check and I can and I'll talk all the shit on Fox News. But the fact that you ran into the fire and you were like, you know what, other people are being thrown under this bus. I don't want that to happen to anybody else. Um, I I think that really is like the perfect encapsulation of this show, Season Fighters. Like people who are in the battle, and it is a battle, and it is one that is not easily won, and is one that happens in phases, and it never but it never ends.
It's never going to end. No.
And it just it's like a Rubik's cube that just adds layers, and it just becomes infinitely complex. um but you know, you've moved so confidently and gracefully, and I just, you know, I can only commend you for how you've dealt with all this. Uh, but my last question of the day, and I mean, we could talk for like
Mhm.
hours, honestly. But my last question today is actually about your work as a creator, not a content creator, but a human creator. As a mom, you know, you share a lot about your ideas on politics, but you're also, I know, a very involved mom, and you know, you're not just a set and forget it and my kids just do whatever. Like you care about them, and I really love that. And um, you know, I want to get your advice as a not parent, but to other parents who are listening. Um, how do you navigate politics and parenting? You know, with the rise of AI and disinformation. What kind of advice? How are you guiding your daughters?
I don't know. See, it's interesting. I think it's age specific, right? When the Black Lives Matter movement was going, I had little kids. And so figuring out ways to talk about race and racism in ways that weren't scary, but help them to understand, you think about fairness, being a good friend, right? Appreciating what makes you the same and what makes you different, right? As they got older in middle school, you have to deal with bullying and identity formation, right? Thinking about how can you be proud of who you are? How do you make friends? What is a friend? Maybe those people aren't your friends, right? And how do you treat people with human dignity? Um, and then in high school, they're becoming independent, and how do you give them a sense of independence? Along the way, you've been doing a lot of critical thinking and questioning, and now you're getting it back at you. If you've been a good parent, you're getting a lot of back talk and makes you, if you do a good job, they're giving you some cogent arguments, and you're realizing, oh, maybe I don't know everything. And so I think for me right now, I'm just really enjoying being a parent of young adults who are really cool people. And that is the craziest thing about being a parent, is realizing that me and my husband were like this cool team, and now there's two other adults as a part of the team that we had something to do with creating, but really they are their own unique, awesome people. And so I'm just enjoying spending time with them and getting to learn from them. And it's wild. Like, I love talking to you because you're a millennial, right? We can kind of check notes. They're Gen Z. And so they're another generation, and they grew up thinking I would buy things. They'd say, oh, mom, can you get me this thing? All you need to do is just get it from the computer, right? Like, you just go on the computer and it will come out. It'll like arrive at your house. So, what's crazy though, and what's wonderful, is they are much more savvy than I was. And they hate AI. Both my girls hate AI. They've seen what it does. One of my daughters got herself a dumb phone and is anti-social media, right? They are very much about human relationships, and hanging out with friends, and oh, they hate fast fashion, right? And so I think It's just been a really crazy ride, and it's just wonderful being a parent. I think the key is just the relationship is the most important thing. And that's one thing that I've learned. That's the only advice that I would give is no matter what, even when you see things differently, the most important thing is the relationship. Because when you get into an argument or when you get into a disagreement, at the end of the day, you love your kids and they need to know that you love them no matter what. And as long as that's there, like everything else is going to work out. And I feel very lucky. They are incredible young people and they actually like hanging out with me sometimes. So I figure that I'm doing okay.
Awesome. Well, Ali, it has been a joy chatting with you. We're definitely gonna have to bring you back. We've all learned so much about disinformation and comms moms,
Yes.
and I really
Now you're going to
appreciate.
see him everywhere.
I
Comms mom.
honestly, I'm gonna have a hit list of the comms moms I need to pay attention to. But I really appreciate you stopping by Season Fighters. But before we head out, can you please tell the folks watching at home what are you working on these days, and where can we find and support you?
Well, I'm really excited. You were my first guest on season 2 of Just Talks podcast, and I'm super, super excited. I only did 5 episodes the first time. It was, when I started out because I was learning the ropes and dealing with a whole bunch of other stuff, which we talked about. But now I'm ready to go, and I'm really excited about the guests that I'll be talking to. So I hope folks will join me and listen to folks that I'm talking to about education and how to fight in our local communities to protect and preserve our democracy. That's on my Patreon as well as on YouTube. And so you can find that at patreon.com/Just Talks podcast. And then additionally, through the Patreon, I'm going to be starting some I want to build community. That's what we need. We need community. So I've decided I want to start an office hours. And so stay tuned for that. It may just include me and my friends dishing on all the annoying people that we see in the news, because we need that. And then additionally, I'm also going to be starting a Writing is Healing group. I've been meeting up with other educators, English teachers, and we just write in a community space online. And I thought, we all need that. So I'm opening that up as well. And so folks are interested in that. I hope they join me. And I'm also working on a project to potentially set up alternative spaces offline, kind of like if you think about in California, this as a Californian, there's earthquake plan and you have to have a safe place to go if like the technology's down. So what I'm trying to do is set up a website as an offline space. If we all have to, if they shut down TikTok or we all have to leave, Facebook or whatever, there's a place we can all go and we know all our friends will be there. So stay tuned and I will definitely keep you in the loop and hopefully you will help me in co-creating these spaces so that we can make sure that we're able to support one another and do it without all the noise.
I am totally on board. I am definitely team touch grass. So, all right, everybody, that is the final bell. Thanks for being in our corner. Don't forget to follow Ali Collins over on all the social medias. We'll be linking it down below. Subscribe to our Patreon. Watch the Just Talks podcast. You'll learn a lot. And we'll see you for another round. Peace.